am an Islamist. I am a feminist. You might not think we have very much in common, but we share essentially the same ideology. And Muslims are oppressed just like every woman.
On January 26, 2016, a YouTube video entitled Feminists Love Islamists was tweeted or retweeted? Is it retweeted or it doesn't matter, by author and evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, who was, up until that point, invited to speak at the annual Northeast Conference on Science and Skepticism. But the following day, this invitation was withdrawn in response to Dr. Dawkins' approving retweet of a highly offensive video. Their argument was, in part, that hateful speech ran contrary to their mission and didn't represent their values.
You are an Islamist, and you are a feminist. We have so very much in common.
We have organized tonight's event to explore one single question. Has political correctness on college campuses gone too far?
On April 25th of the same year, an event was hosted at the University of Massachusetts called The Triggering. Has political correctness gone too far? One of the featured guests, former professor of philosophy Christina Hoff Sommers, was addressing the audience when a young woman in the audience, seen here flipping and flopping birds, decided to start heckling.
All right, I am here to provide some adult supervision. Colleges! Calm down, young lady. Please. Future historians are going to look back at what...
Please.
Future generations will look back... Shh, okay.
I'm sorry.
3 strikes, you're out, darling.
One more disruption and we'd have to ask you to leave the venue.
My free speech! But this is free speech if you're so concerned.
Please keep your comments to the Q&A section. Thank you.
I invited her here as a demonstration of utter madness.
A couple of months later, in July, shortly after the all-female Ghostbusters reboot hit theaters, one of its stars, Leslie Jones, began receiving a series of racist tweets. As a consequence of her campaign to report these users, dozens of Twitter accounts were deleted from the platform. And as a guest on Late Night with Seth Meyers, Miss Jones made the following statement.
And to let people know freedom of speech, because I know a lot of people came at me with that, you know, hey, you mess with freedom of speech. Hey, hate speech and freedom of speech, 2 different things.
2 different things.
Did you notice a pattern? Among these 3 examples, there are 2 things which occurred each time. One was the condemnation of hate speech, the other was the endorsement of free speech. The NECSS made certain to state that they believe strongly in freedom of speech. The obnoxious college student insisted that her freedom of speech was merely being exercised, and Leslie Jones, who perhaps said it most efficiently, insisted that hate speech and freedom of speech existed separately. So it seems that the argument being made here is that hate speech can be censored without freedom of speech being compromised. With all of the... With all of this hoopla over hate speech, how exactly is it defined? Is it merely the expression of hatred, which is not an inherently immoral emotion? According to Merriam-Webster, hate speech expresses hatred of a particular group of people. According to dictionary.com, hate speech is speech that attacks, threatens, or insults a person or a group on the basis of national origin, ethnicity, color, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. So you see, it's not really as simple as saying I hate you, but rather, I hate you because of who you are or what you believe. Now, how is freedom of speech defined? According to the same sources, Merriam-Webster defines it as the legal right to express one's opinions freely. Dictionary.com defines it as the right of people to express their opinions publicly without government interference, and then it proceeds to list a few limitations. And indeed, even in the United States, with the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, there are limits on what you can say. For example, the First Amendment does not protect fraud, obscenity, defamation, child pornography, threats of violence, inciting violence, copyright infringement, revealing classified information, shouting fire in a crowded place when there is, in fact, no fire at all. That's a popular one. And its protections are also limited if you're a student in school, serving in the military, or in a courtroom, for whatever reason. So, what about hate speech? Does the First Amendment leave hate speech out to dry as well? Well, there's no better place to find the answer than the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1969, the court ruled that a Ku Klux Klan member's speech was protected. In 1992, the court ruled that speech cannot be criminalized simply because of its content. In the famous 2011 ruling, the court ruled in favor of the Westboro Baptist Church and its followers' right to use these damn signs during their protests. And once again, in 2017, the court ruled unanimously that government prohibition of racially disparaging trademarks was unconstitutional. Justice Samuel Alito once wrote, "Speech that demeans on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, disability, or any other similar ground is hateful, but the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect freedom to express the thought that we hate." Justice Anthony Kennedy once wrote, "A law that can be directed against speech found offensive to some portion of the public can be turned against minority and dissenting views, to the detriment of all." If the Supreme Court decides over and over again that X is protected by the Bill of Rights, any argument in favor of prohibiting X seems like a non-starter. But this is just a legal argument after all, and it only applies to the United States of America. What about everyone else, everywhere else? Is there a philosophical argument against banning hate speech? Well, consider the philosophy of free expression. All ideas, all opinions, all arguments, and all points of view are on the table. That's the philosophy behind freedom of speech, and that's why the First Amendment does not protect any of this crap. None of these things qualify as an opinion or an argument. Infringing copyright or screaming false alarms are obviously not in the category of expressing a point of view. But when somebody such as Leslie Jones argues, or well rather just insists, that hate speech and freedom of speech are two different things, the statement itself, while linguistically correct, is just about as mind-blowing as saying junk food and eating food are two different things. Yeah, one is a specific category of things which can be eaten, while the other is the act of eating in general, but one encompasses the other. Just as hate speech is a specific category of viewpoints, while freedom of speech is the expression of viewpoints in general. If somebody stated in one sentence that you can eat any food you like, and in the next sentence said, however, you cannot eat junk food, the second sentence would contradict the first, and the advocacy for eating anything is effectively abolished. Similarly, if the concept of free speech encompasses all points of view, then a failure to tolerate even one point of view effectively throws the baby out with the bathwater. And that's what makes statements like this so logically wobbly. We believe strongly in freedom of speech and freedom to express unpopular and even offensive views. However, unnecessarily divisive, counterproductive, and even hateful speech runs contrary to our mission. Well, look, in spite of all these adjectives, the rhetorical equivalent of these two sentences is this: we believe in X, however, X runs contrary to our mission. This is not to ignore all of these adjectives, they're still relevant, and they seem to only dig a deeper hole. Try to think of a point of view which is both unpopular and offensive, but which is not hateful, divisive, or counterproductive. And if you have, how do you know you have? Because these adjectives are all subjective. Popularity is based on public opinion and depends on who you poll. Offensiveness is based on personal sentiment. Hatred is an emotion varying wildly in degree from person to person. Whether or not something is counterproductive depends on your own goals. And as for something being unnecessarily divisive, who gets to decide what is and isn't necessary? Answer: we do. We all do. Once again, all of this is subjective. If you lived in the United States in the 19-teens and said women should have the vote, or said in the 1850s that slaves should be emancipated, or rallied in the 1770s for independence from Great Britain, your statements would be considered by at least some people to be unpopular, offensive, hateful, counterproductive, and unnecessarily divisive, most likely by those who were against those causes. That wouldn't prove that the causes were lost, and it definitely wouldn't mean that the statements shouldn't have been made. All it would mean was that people had opinions and people disagreed. But why stop here? Somebody else might consider such statements to be an attack on men, or a threat to white people, or an insult to the British. Attacks, threats, and insults. If these three terms sound familiar, that's because they appear in the definition of hate speech. And since men are a gender, white is a color, and the British are citizens of a nation, if any of them felt attacked, threatened, or insulted by certain speech, wouldn't that therefore render it hate speech? No, this is not a rhetorical question. The answer is either yes or no. If the answer is yes, then advocating for American independence, freeing slaves, and women voting, surprisingly, qualifies as hate speech. And if the answer is no, well then that just means we're picking and choosing which opinions are hateful and which opinions are not based on our own opinions. You see the problem here? If the only way to determine a hateful point of view is your own point of view, then this isn't a line of reasoning as much as it's a circle. And this is what makes the concept of hate speech so bootless. We all belong to a group. We all have a country, a color, a gender, a sexual slant, etc. So if being insulted on the basis of any of that is all it takes, we've all spouted hate speech. You might not think that you have, personally, but if somebody else does, who the hell are you to disagree? As far as concepts go, the concept of hate speech is practically useless. If it's not enough that the definition is too broad, the right of free speech legally protects it. The concept of free speech logically requires it. The standards are subjective, the reasoning is circular, and perhaps worst of all is that it can apply to anybody with a political opinion. So the idea of banning hate speech really does not seem like a good idea. For anyone's sake, because if Pandora's box is opened up today, you might find yourself on the receiving end of this by tomorrow.
Speakers are not only disinvited, but when they're invited, people come in to disrupt. They don't want others to hear. We have...
There comes a time when the truth gets in the way.